Today, we are talking about cash. Cash is king, is what they say. And I couldn't agree more, honestly. Cash in your bank account as a practice owner is so important. And I think if you own a dental practice and you think about managing your practice and making decisions about your practice, as an accountant, I love to look at a profit and loss, at a balance sheet. I love to look at your EBITDA and all these numbers that we talk about. But in reality, I believe there are so many practice owners that log into their bank account, look at how much cash they have, and that tells them if they're doing a good job or a bad job. It tells them if they can take some money out or if they should leave some money in. Everyone is looking at their bank accounts to run their business in the heat of the moment. And honestly, I don't think that's a terrible thing. Like, I still think there's value to be had by looking at some financials, looking at some overhead numbers, looking at cash flow types of things. But really, it's hard to get that in real time. And as much as I think our firm does a really good job about getting financial statements quickly and whatnot, looking at your bank account is where you're always going to go. And when you do that, though, how do you know what your cash number should be? How much cash should you have? Do you have too much? Do you not have enough? What are the numbers that you should think about when you look at your cash flow? Now, we learned some really valuable lessons during COVID. And I think I speak for all of us when we really don't want another COVID, another pandemic to come. But we all have our own individual crises that come up, whether it's a sickness, a disability, those kinds of things come up unexpectedly. And you really want to be in a good place with your cash so that you're not immediately stressed when those things come up. So I think this is an important topic. We're going to talk today about how to determine what your number should be. How much cash should you have in your bank account? And you might be below that number and you need to work towards it. You might be well above that number and you need to start deploying your cash somewhere else. I do have a really sweet high yield savings account that I want to throw out there. This is something right now, interest rates are high and they've stayed high longer than people thought they were. And it sucks in a lot of levels. But if you have extra cash and you have a business that has a decent amount of cash, you can use these high interest rates to your advantage. So I have something I'm going to talk about at the end of this episode that I think will make most practice owners somewhere between $2,000 to $7,000 a year with virtually very little effort. And it's all related to making sure you understand the number for your cash. So let's get into it and talk about your cash balance as a practice owner. All right, first let's talk about how much cash should you have in your practice? If you're thinking about this question, the answer is not scientific. It's fairly subjective. There's a lot of differing opinions and there's a lot of subjectivity in your own personal preference. But a general rule of thumb that I heard very early on in my days of dental accounting is you want 2 months of overhead as cash reserves in the business. Now, what they meant as overhead, that could mean a lot of different things. Do you include your debt? Do you include the owner compensation? What do we even do about taxes? Like, what's included in this overhead and why 2 months? And over the years, I've come up with what I call a range of your cash number. I feel pretty confident that there is a minimum amount of cash that you should have in your bank account. And I also feel pretty confident there is a maximum number of the amount of cash that you should have in your bank account. And when I say maximum amount, I'm saying, okay, you're being conservative, you're setting some money aside, you're having this cash reserve, but at a certain point, your cash is not doing you any good in your bank account. And it could be much better utilized going somewhere else, funding a retirement plan or investing in the business. There's a lot of other things that you could do with excess cash. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit. So let's build this range for determining how much cash you should have in your bank account. And let's start with the minimum amount. So the first category. There's two categories that I consider you should look at for the minimum amount of cash that you should have in your bank account. And those two minimum amounts are practice overhead, and I'm going to define that because I just said that that term is used loosely, and practice debt, which is typically not included in practice overhead. So when I count your practice overhead, I would look at staff salaries, I would look at your rent and other occupancy expenses, your labs and supplies costs, your marketing, your professional fees, so accounting fees, your insurances, and any other office expense or administrative expenses that you have for running your business. We are not including any doctor compensation, any doctor benefits, any automobile expense. We're not including that in this number. We're talking about key practice overhead numbers for your staff and other costs for your practice. Look at that number for the year and divide it by 12. So you want your average monthly amount for practice overhead. And then we're going to add your practice debt. So whatever loans you have in your practice, how much do you pay in debt each month? And I'm including the total debt payment. So the principal and interest portion, total debt payment each month. And we are going to come up with your average practice overhead plus your practice debt for 1 month. And this is our minimum amount. This number is important because if you think about the course of 1 month, your cash flow comes in kind of lumpy. It doesn't always come in the same flow, and your expenses go out kind of lumpy. There are some practices where they have their rent payment and some lab bills or whatever, and they pay them all at the beginning of the month. So cash gets low at the beginning of the month, and then as the month goes on, it kind of builds up. But every practice has kind of a different flow on a month-to-month basis of how their cash fluctuates. And because of that, you want to have at least a minimum amount of cushion so that regardless of the flow of income that's coming in and the expenses that are going out, you always know that there's enough cash there to pay expenses. We're not worried about building a reserve, but when you go and process payroll, you need to absolutely make sure that there's enough cash in your bank account when you process payroll, or that will cause you a lot of problems. And most practices that have been tight on cash understand that concept, and you don't even want to get close to that. So we're talking practice overhead, practice debt, 1 month's worth of that, and that is the minimum amount of cash that you want to have in your practice. Now, let's assume you have a $1 million dental practice with a 65% overhead ratio, and that's the goal for a lot of GP practices. If that's the case, your practice overhead is $650,000 for the year, which is about $55,000 per month. Let's say you recently bought this $1 million practice and you have an $800,000 loan and it's financed over 10 years. Let's just say your practice debt in that case is around $9,000 a month. So with the $55,000 average per month in overhead costs plus the $9,000 per month in loans, debt service, you're looking at about $64,000 a month as a good place to start for a minimum amount of cash reserves. Now, because you will be managing your practice based on this number to some degree, I would round this number to the nearest 10,000, and I would round it up to be a little bit conservative. So if this was my practice, $1 million in collections, 65% overhead, $9,000 a month in debt, all these assumptions, I would say, hey, the minimum amount of cash that I need to have in my bank account is $70,000 a month. That's a number that I can remember. And as I look at my bank account, I'm going to be concerned if I get below $70,000. All right, that's the minimum amount. Now let's talk about how to calculate the maximum amount. So we're going to use those same numbers that we use for the minimum amount, the practice overhead and the practice debt. But now we need to add in the doctors. And there's really two types of doctors. There's associate doctors and there's owner doctors. For our associate doctors, this is some personal preference. I typically exclude associates from my calculation of cash reserves. The reason is the associate compensation is typically a variable calculation, meaning if you have an associate in your practice, you shouldn't be paying them unless they are actually producing. Now, I get that sometimes you might have a fixed per diem for an associate to give them some assurances when they come in, but really most associate compensation, even if it has a per diem, you should only pay an associate if they're actually doing work in the practice. And so I'm less concerned about something happening in the practice and me not being able to pay my associate, because if they're there coming in, it's a direct variable benefit of their production results in their compensation. So I typically exclude them, but you can add them if you want to. But the big one I look at is you as the owner. And we're going to add in your salary into this cash reserve calculation. Now, I do want to point out a couple things with owners. There's a couple big variables. For example, some practice owners are the sole provider of income in their household. Others have dual income, and maybe the practice income is less important to their family finances. Additionally, some people have personal cash emergency funds that are outside of the practice. They have a decent amount of emergency funds saved, and they're not really worried about the practice overhead or the practice financials supporting their personal lifestyle. So there are a lot of different things that could impact this number, but just to be conservative, let's assume that if you are an owner of a practice, we want to count how much income you need each month to live comfortably. And I always cringe when I say that word, live comfortably, because you might say to yourself, well, I'm not comfortable on an IKEA couch. I'm only comfortable on Restoration Hardware. And that might be true, but I'm talking about like student loans, your mortgage, your normal food, taxes, those kinds of things, just your essential living expenses, not like you're pinching pennies unnecessarily, but like what do you kind of need to keep the juices going in your personal life so that you don't feel stressed? And there's different ways to get that number. You don't have to go too nitro actually to get that number. You could just look at your credit card statements for a few months, your mortgage. There's a few places you could look to kind of get this number pretty quickly. But hopefully you can come up with a number of how much you need from your practice to cover most of your personal expenses. And in our example right now, let's just assume that number is $15,000 that you come up with between student loans and mortgage and things like that. So we're going to say in the minimum cash reserve amount, that was 1 month's worth of practice overhead and practice debt got us to $64,000. Now I'm going to add 1 month's worth of my owner's living needs. That's $15,000, which is going to take me to $79,000 per month. And if I want to be conservative, I'm going to take 2 months worth of that, or $158,000. That's pretty dang close to $160,000. I'm going to round to that nearest 10,000 number so it's easy to remember. So in this example, I've built on the minimum side of the amount of cash that I want to have in my bank account is $70,000. And on the high side, the most amount of cash I want to have in my practice is $160,000. And I'm using a hypothetical dental practice that collects $1 million and has 65% overhead. But based on my experience, because I do this with all of my clients and I've done it for several years, these are actually pretty consistent numbers I see across the board. Now, there's always some bigger practices and some smaller practices, but a range between 70,000 and 160,000 is honestly pretty common. And this range of the minimum and maximum doesn't necessarily say that you should pick one or the other, but you should pick a number somewhere in there. And how do you pick that number? It's, again, this is not scientific. And there are some CPAs that will say the minimum is too low or the maximum is too high. But this builds a pretty good range. And you should ask yourself, thinking about this range of the minimum amount and the maximum amount, what scares me more? Not having cash when you need it, or missing out on a much better use of your cash. Some people really want to make sure they're utilizing their cash appropriately. If you talk to a financial advisor, they will tell you that the cash sitting in your bank account is doing you no good and you need to get it out of there as soon as possible. But there's a lot of people who have a mental feeling around looking at their bank account and feeling comfortable. It takes the edge off of some just feelings about their life. There's an awesome book that you may have heard of called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. I read it. I loved the book. I think everyone should read the book because it talks about how a lot of financial decisions are really emotional and designed around getting peace of mind. And the author talks about how he paid off his house with cash. So he has no mortgage. And you could probably talk to 100 financial advisors and 99.9 of them will tell you that that's not a good financial decision because you can usually get a low interest rate on a mortgage, and investing that cash in the market will build you greater wealth over time. So as a strict money decision, it's probably not a good idea to pay off your house. But the author talks about how he was in a position to do this and how much peace it brought him personally, and he doesn't regret it. And you have to think about that when you think about cash in your practice. You want to be at a place that makes you feel comfortable. And if you're okay getting rid of cash and deploying it in other places, that's great. But if you really want that cushion, that's okay. Just understand where you are mentally. And again, I'm trying to give this conservative maximum number. Really, I don't think you're going to need much more than the maximum amount per the calculations that we've talked about. One thing to also note, just as a little side note, when we talk about building cash reserves in your practice, it's important to note that this money is typically going to be taxed by the IRS. And here's what I mean. If you make $1 million, let's go back to this example. You collect $1 million in your dental practice. You have 65% overhead. You take some compensation to yourself. And let's say you're left over with a profit of $200,000. And so you have $200,000 sitting in your bank account. Well, the IRS is going to tax you on that $200,000. And let's say you only take out $100,000 for yourself, but you leave another $100,000 in the business. So you only feel the $100,000 that you took out because you left $100,000 in the business. Well, you're going to be taxed on that $200,000. And in future years, you'll have $100,000 in your bank account and you can pull it out effectively without having tax consequences. So it can create some timing issues and differences, but just know if you're in the building up of cash mode, you might feel a little pinch of you're paying taxes on this cash that you're leaving in your business. And that's just an unfortunate side effect of the process of building up cash. But once you have those cash reserves built up, you really won't feel that discrepancy. Now, what is the best thing to do with the cash that's in your bank account? Now, I will acknowledge there are people that are on different sides of the cash spectrum. Some people have a lot of cash. Some people wish they had more cash in their bank account, and they're having a hard time getting on top of that. And I will plan to tackle both of these in a lot more detail. But I just want to make a quick note about excess cash in your business, because I see this a lot with dental practice owners. And I always say there's 5 things that you can do with excess cash. You can invest it in your business, like equipment and marketing. You can invest it in yourself, so CE type things. You can invest it for your future, so think retirement accounts, brokerage accounts, savings, those types of things. You could pay down debt. So you could pay down student loans, your practice loan, your mortgage, different things. So you could pay down debt. Or the 5th thing is you could enjoy it. Just, go on a vacation, buy something crazy. So there's really 5 categories that I put what you could do with excess cash. But sometimes before you kind of get to those 5 things, you really want to be intentional about it. So sometimes the money is just sitting in your account until you decide what you want to do with it. And even if you have some automated things set up, sometimes you really want to be intentional, and it's just sitting in your checking account. And there are some really good options of what you should consider to do with cash that is just sitting in your checking account. And I'm going to talk just for a second about high yield savings accounts. So I think a lot of dentists are probably familiar with money market accounts or certificate of deposit CDs or high yield savings accounts. And I think between those three options, the best option is a high yield savings account for your business. And I spent a lot of time trying to research the best high yield savings accounts out there. And I feel pretty confident there is one that really stands out. I'm not getting paid for this, but because it sounds like I'm pushing one product over the other, which I am, but I just think it's the best. The reason I like high yield savings accounts is you can typically get a pretty high interest rate that you earn, not quite as high as CDs, but you get all the liquidity of a savings account. So you can move the money in and out however you please, which you don't get with a certificate of deposit or a CD. So I just think high yield savings accounts are really, really great. And I went down this rabbit hole one time of looking up high yield savings accounts for businesses. And I had a really hard time finding a good product. There are a lot of really, really good high yield savings accounts for individuals. But if you want this high yield savings account in the name of your business, which I think you do, and there's a lot of reasons we could talk about that, but you want this to be a business account. You don't want to just use a personal account for this exercise that we'll talk about. There are not a lot of great options. And so when I found this one option, I was super stoked. And it's called Flourish Cash. And the reason I like it is they consistently have the highest rates. The way they organize the bank accounts is they stack it with different bank accounts behind the scenes. So your FDIC insurance can be more than 250,000. So if you have a really large group practice and your cash reserves are more than 250,000, you can have the assurance that you have a higher FDIC insurance because of how they stack the bank accounts on the back end. But my all-time favorite thing about Flourish Cash is how they allow you to automate rules. And what you would do is you would set up a Flourish savings account and you would create a rule to say, anytime my checking account is over a certain dollar amount, move that money into the Flourish account. And then you have another rule that says, anytime my checking account goes below a certain amount, pull funds from the Flourish account. So once you create this account and once you set up the rules, you don't even have to manage it. It just manages itself. And I know I've seen enough dentists that just sit on a pile of cash and not do anything with it, that their Flourish account would automatically pull those funds into that account and start earning them a very, very high savings amount. And one thing that you could do, as we talked about the minimum amount of cash and the maximum amount of cash, and if we go back to our example and we say, okay, if the minimum amount of cash that I need to have in my bank account is 70,000, what if we made a rule? And let's just add a little bit of cushion there, and let's just say 80,000. Anytime my checking account is more than $80,000, I am going to move the money out of the checking account and into the Flourish account. And it can sit in that Flourish account however long you want and start earning you interest. And in this example, let's just say we had this rule at 80,000. Anytime my checking account is more than 80,000, I'm going to move it into the Flourish account. Well, we know that, and let's say you want to keep the maximum amount of cash possible, which is again about 160,000. So that would mean that there is about another 80,000 that's just going to sit in your Flourish account, earning, right now it's 4%. So it's going to be earning 4% just sitting there. And if you did this year, you would make over $3,000 by just letting the money sit there, literally doing nothing. And it's going to make $3,000. Now you could have another rule to say, hey, if my checking account goes below 65,000, I'm going to pull that money back in and replenish my checking account, that's great. But I think what a lot of times will happen is people will set up this rule and that Flourish account will grow above 80,000. It'll get to 100,000, 120,000 until you decide how to deploy that cash. It's at least not being wasted and you're earning 4% for just letting the money sit there. So I would highly consider that, setting up a high yield savings account. And remember, your cash is critical. And you should know, if you look at your bank account, you should know in your mind what your number should be. And if you don't, go through this calculation. And if you need help, always feel free to reach out. But just know, too little cash is stressful. Too much is inefficient. So find that right place for you. Utilize a high yield savings account. And it's okay if you're running your practice on your cash flow. Just make sure you have a good idea of what you're doing. Thanks so much for listening. Go to the YouTube channel if you want to make any comments. I'd love to hear if people have other savings accounts that they use that they think are awesome, other ways that they approach their cash. Would love to hear about it. Thanks so much.